Hello, class. We are back and we're going to talk about chapter 3. And this is where we're going to talk about the models of abnormality. And I just want to be clear that when we're talking about the models of psychology, we're really talking about perspectives. You're going to hear me use that word interchangeably. So I'll say a lot of times this is a psychological perspective, this is the biological perspective, this is the psychosocial perspective, this is the cognitive behavioral perspective. So it's really just these models that we put together and they kind of guide us like a pair of sunglasses. So think about if I had a rose colored pair of sunglasses and I have a yellow tinted lenses on another pair, and then I have super clear and maybe some dark tint. So every time I put one on, I see things differently. I don't know if you've ever looked through yellow tinted lenses in sunglasses, but it's kind of cool. You put them on and the sky takes on a whole new color and everything is crisper. Actually, it's kind of neat to look through the different colored lenses. That's what the models are. We come from a different perspective. We see things in that way. So if I'm coming from a model that's all about biological bases of behavior and I'm looking through the psychosocial model, then I'm going to look for, okay, I have this social problem, or I have this problem where they're not getting along or they're aggressive in school, and I want to look at what's going on in the brain, what is highlighted, what when they watch something, does their brain light up differently than another? Is there something involved in the brain or in the neurochemistry or brain circuitry? So I'm going to look at those things to see if there's a difference, and that's the way I'm going to approach it. That's the way I start to look at things. The problem with that is any isolated perspective is not going to do it. So I'm going to tell you in the end, and your book is going to tell you in the end, like it's some epiphany, that we should use all the models and we should integrate them. You should always consider every perspective when you're looking at a problem and all the possibilities, because it could be multiple things that are leading up to what the problem is. So speaking of biological and bringing it up right from the beginning, let's talk about the biological model. So just some background on it. It has been referred to as the medical model. And this perspective actually looks at psychological abnormality as an illness. So think about the medical model where you have a doctor and you have a patient, you have a medicine that you give to solve the problem. You give some kind of drug. Okay, so this typically will look at problems through brain anatomy or brain chemistry, which nicely makes it a candidate to use some kind of drug intervention or some kind of, well, we'll go over some of the alterations you can do with the brain to kind of zap the brain with little ECT here and there. That really works when it comes to depression. Let's say you're a biological theorist, you're coming from that perspective, and how are you going to explain abnormal behavior? Well, the first thing we're going to do is look at the brain anatomy, and we're going to consider the different parts of the brain that are involved with certain actions and behaviors and feelings and emotions. So looking at this photo here, you'll see different parts of the brain that we know are involved in some of the circuitry or the brain circuits that underlie things that come along with psychological disorders. For example, if you have anxiety, we know that the amygdala and the fear circuit is involved. So we're going to go over the fear circuit and what it is and the parts that are included with it. So looking at these brain structures, we have to consider neurons and glial cells, the parts of the brain and the connections between them. And we've talked about this in your intro class. So we had a great study on neurons, and in fact, let's see, we have a slide on the neuron. Okay, so you know how neurons communicate normally within the brain. We went over this. We did a lot of fun stuff when we performed live cells and stuff in class. So the neurons, basically start with a chemical stimulation, so the EPSPs and the IPSPs, and then eventually it builds up enough till it passes threshold and causes that neuron to fire. When that action potential, when that all or nothing electrical charge goes down the axon, you can see in this picture here, the axon is right here. It comes down to the ending or the terminal endings, or the terminal buttons, if you remember those names of the cell, and in them are these little pockets of synaptic vesicles, which is where we used to put the Hershey Kisses, right? So these migrate, when that big fire comes down, they start migrating to the cell membrane, and calcium channels open, gated channels, and things happen, and what happens? They open and they spill their contents out into the synaptic cleft. So remember, they don't really touch. Neurons don't touch each other. They come very, very close. And it's in that gap that the neurotransmitters are released, and they go over to the receiving cell, receiving neuron, and there's receptors there. And if they fit the correct keyhole, it's like the key has to fit the keyhole, if you remember that, then they will cause an IPSB or EPSB, which is a small electrical pulse going down to the cell body, just like what happened up here. So we go from electrical to chemical to electrical, electrical to chemical to electrical. That's the transmission. That's the way they communicate. That's a very simple explanation of it. And one of the abnormal behaviors that we're going to look at in detail, or it's actually a disorder or a disease, is schizophrenia. So schizophrenia is treated best from this perspective in a lot of ways. Now we're going to look at all the treatments that are necessary with schizophrenia. One of the ways that you can see what's necessary, I want you to watch the video that I gave you a connection to for John Nash. Well, I'll make sure you have the connection for that, but you need to watch that video on John Nash. It's a video on schizophrenia, and it teaches you a lot about the different perspectives and the different ways he's been treated, and the things that he has to do, and the times that he went off his medication. He would take his medication, he would go off his medication, he would disappear. His wife, the last wife he was with, left him for desertion. And then in the end, she came back to him, and he learned to live with his disease. He learned to ignore the voices. He learned to not act on them. He learned to fake, or not really fake, but just behave in a way that society expects him to, so that he won't be hospitalized. So he actually learned to deal with his disorder. I suggest you watch it, because I will probably refer to it here and there during the course, and I will definitely probably refer to it on the test. So it's a good thing to be acquainted with. Endocrine system. So you can see right here when we're talking about the hormones, the endocrine system is our hormonal system. We know that the pituitary gland is involved in commanding release of hormones, but then we also have all these different areas throughout our periphery that are dealing with the hormones as well. So we know that there's an abnormal secretion of the hormone cortisol, and that's linked to anxiety and mood disorders. So we have that. And then we also have the brain circuitry itself. So when we're talking about brain circuitry, when we're looking at something like this chemical activity, we can't just focus on the neurotransmitter and say, okay, well, there's a lack of serotonin, which is what we find with depression. And if we just increase serotonin, then we can fix it. Well, sometimes an increase of serotonin activity or inhibiting of other activities may help. That's true. But what we found is there's a fear circuit. So it's not just one area or a global thing of neurotransmitters. It's a particular brain circuit that we find that may be involved in the role of these disorders. So for example, the fear circuit. The fear circuit is a circuit I want you to know the parts of. It's the amygdala, it's the prefrontal cortex, it's the insula, and the anterior cingulate cortex. All of these circuits, all of those parts of the brain work together as a circuit. So when one's stimulated, it projects the neurotransmitter, or the neuron projects to another part and stimulates another part. And it starts in the amygdala where our emotions are and projects out to those other parts. And that causes that fight or flight reaction. That causes that fear reaction that we have. And quite often with anxiety, that's the circuit that is in this circuit. There's a number of neurotransmitters that are involved. So GABA, and I want you to know these. So with the fear circuit, we know that GABA is involved. We know that serotonin is involved. We know that norepinephrine is involved, and we know that dopamine is involved. So though all of those neurotransmitters are important. So that way you can see you can't just focus on one. So we want to study the circuits. Now, the sources of these abnormalities, we know that there's a number of factors involved. So that can be involved with malfunctioning of brain structures. So we look at biological abnormalities as sometimes being the result of genetic inheritance. And your book highlights two things. They say that genetic inheritance is one way these work and evolution is the other. So let's look at genetic inheritance. We know that each cell in the human body contains 23 chromosomes. And if you look down here, and this is why I didn't put this to full screen, sometimes I will add some extra notes down here. So when you go through your slides, you can always go back to these. Now, of course, you can always do this, and you can watch a full screen if that's more enjoyable to you, and we can leave it that way. But I do want you to see that at the bottom, sometimes there's an additional note. So when you go back over these slides and do a little more study for your prep for your test, don't forget that those notes are down there, and that's the way that you see them, is to leave it like that. Okay, so we know that studies with genes have revealed that sometimes, a lot of times, these genes are in control of these certain traits and characteristics. So we can inherit abnormalities, abnormal psychological disturbances. And you'll see when you watch the movie on John Nash, and you can even look up further, Google him and see other movies with his son. His son was passed on this genetic abnormality of schizophrenia. His son is struggling, I think, more, it looks like, where he is. He's young, of course, and he's struggling with dealing with it. And his father is there with him, and just there's some great interactions available online that you can watch. And studies also suggest that inheritance plays at least some part in almost all mental disorders. So I want you to keep that in mind, the ones that we really term as a mental disorder. So mood disorders, schizophrenia, mental, there's just so many, and we're going to go over as many as we can this semester, the big ones. So a mutation is not a positive thing. It's not something you want. And the problem is that mutations can be passed on. So they're inherited to the next family member. And in most cases, it's several genes that combine to produce our actions and our reactions. Kind of goes totally against the theory of evolution, because the whole premise of evolution is survival, and survival of the fittest, and adaptation. So when you think about the theory of evolution, where we evolve to survive, so we evolve keeping the traits that are good for survival and getting rid of traits that are not, mutations is something that is a bad thing, that goes against the theory. We would not evolve carrying mutations. Somehow there should be a mechanism in that theory to get rid of mutation. Evolution occurs over millions of years, so obviously we didn't just evolve into having these genetic abnormalities as a result of some kind of evolutionary process. It's just genetic inheritance, and I think genetic inheritance is a great way to explain it. Some kind of mutation happened and you passed it on to your kids. It's not because it was some kind of evolutionary tactic so that we could survive better, because it's the opposite of survival. It's actually something that hurts survival. It goes against survival of the fittest. It's something we should have evolved out of us completely. So, yep, it could be radiation cause a mutation. There's all kinds of things that cause a mutation, and those things happen in life, and then you pass it on to your offspring, and it's, as a result, it moves on to the next generation. Okay, so let's talk about biological treatments, though. Biology has been successful, the biological perspective, because when we do find that there's some kind of abnormality physically, then we can kind of treat that. We can use drugs, we can use brain stimulation, which I alluded to a little earlier. We're going to talk about ECT and other forms of brain stimulation, and psychosurgery, which is lobotomies, and you probably heard of those. So let's get into it a little further. So drug therapy comes along about the 1950s. There were 4 major types of drug groups, and I want you to know all 4 of these. And this is an area where I give you just a few more notes down on the bottom, just in case. Okay, so anti-anxiety drugs we know are for anxiety, or they're for some kind of tension. So when someone feels frustrated or uncomfortable or tightened up or tensed and worried, like panic disorders. Okay, so anti-anxiety drugs are very effective in these areas. Oops. Okay, antidepressant drugs, we know those are good for depression, right? It's in the name. So that's going to be so easy for you to remember on the test because it's right there in the name. And let's see, where were we? Anti-bipolar drugs. Okay, so bipolar disorder is one that we're going to look at. Manic depressives. So these kinds of drugs stabilize the mood, where somebody's going from manic for days or weeks and then suddenly in this deep depression. They go from opposite ends, polar ends. That's why we're bipolar. That's where the name comes from. So people can experience these great times of manic feelings of euphoria, happiness. I'm going to conquer the world. I'm going to get all this done. Unending energy to complete depression. Can't get myself out of the house. Can't go to work today. Kind of effects. And then antipsychotic drugs deal with confusing, disturbing thoughts that don't make sense. So they help people get rid of that confusion and start to think clearly again. Now we can go into the different brain stimulations. And we've talked about ECT, which is electroconvulsive therapy, which has been around a long time. It works really well, especially with someone who's suicidal or depressed. It's kind of like pushing restart on a game. If you just threw all the cells out into chaos and then brought them all back into a new restart, clear perspective. It's kind of what it does. Does it last? For some people, it does. I've watched videos when I was a student and I tried to find them and I couldn't find them. There's this one woman that she thought she was the devil. Was when they showed her before treatment, her face was super greasy and oily. Her hair was all oily because she hadn't washed it in so long. She stopped showering. She was highly depressed. She had a family, kids, husband. She had a normal life. She went into this deep depression and couldn't get out of it. It got worse and worse. She stopped taking care of herself. She started thinking she was evil. She started swearing she was the devil. It was amazing, right? So you see this person like this. She goes through electric shock therapy, and then and at the time back then they caused grand mal seizures, right? So it causes this seizure. She comes out of it. I guess they put her in the shower afterwards. She was a totally different person. Didn't even look like the same person. It was the same voice, but man, did she look different. She was happy. She was laughing at the videos of herself. She goes, I can't believe I thought I was the devil. She said, I don't know where it came from. I don't know why I was like that. She was a completely different person, happy, and didn't have to have any more treatment. She went back to her life. I was fine. Sometimes that's the case. Other times, like with the autistic example that I'll show you, it's not the case. Sometimes it is the fact that it helps, but then those old behaviors, whatever were underlying them, whatever were causing them, they come back. And then the ECT has to be administered again. Okay, so you've probably seen the movies and you've heard from different organizations for human rights that it's so terrible, it's such an awful thing, and it is awful to watch someone have a grand mal seizure. Well, they don't have to go through that anymore. We have modern day. So I'm going to show you an example of yesterday and then an example of ECT today. So let's watch this together. Now, I believe there's no sound. Yeah, there's no sound on this because it's so old, but we'll watch it anyway. You can see what happens. So you can see what they're going to put these on each side of his brain. The nurse, you're going to see, it's going to look like she's a little rough with him, but what she's doing is putting something in his mouth so he doesn't bite his tongue off, also to keep the airway open. All right, so they're turning up the shock meter there. Not quite sure. I can't see the volts. Okay, so now he's going through the seizure, and she's just making sure that he doesn't bite his tongue off. She's keeping his mouth open, making sure that he doesn't choke or anything. Okay, so he's going through the process, and the nurses they're not showing you his whole body, but a little further in the video here, they'll show you more of someone's body so you can see everything kind of cringes up, cramps up, convulses. And it's kind of hard to watch, you know. It's a little hard to watch. Now remember, this person's not doing it involuntarily. He's doing it voluntarily. It's like a last resort when you get to the point of not being able to function anymore at all and just your thinking is so distorted. Okay, so here's someone else. And again, she's going to come around and do the mouth. Okay, you see his body tensing up. His arm bending, and now you'll see a little more of his legs. Okay, so this is what happens to the body. It does look scary. See his hand curling up there? See the curling? That's what they do. Their toes, they'll do that too. For some people, that's a lifesaver though. Okay, so now let's go to this one.
16-year-old Jonah is about to have electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, today in America.
And we're doing bilateral electrode placement at 20%.
Our cameras have been invited for the first time to film this controversial treatment on a child.
Modern ECT is a very simple, safe, quick procedure.
Some call for a total ban on ECT for children.
It's traumatic brain injury, very much like somebody who's just endured a severe concussion.
But Jonah's mother, Amy, is campaigning to allow more children like him to have the procedure.
There's no doubt that ECT is the only reason that Jonah has any quality of life whatsoever.
Mommy.
Jonah is autistic, and before the treatment, he used to lash out and punch himself.
Her nose is busted and was bleeding, and she was just constantly just punching herself.
I was convinced that our love would heal her.
ECT is rarely used in these cases, but some families feel it's their only option.
I have to have hope that it's going to be a miracle for Sophia, because we need a miracle. So those were the first pictures that we ever got of her.
So this was of Sophia in the orphanage?
Yes. She was probably 2 years old in those.
Hang on! Hold on, Sophia. Hold on. In 2009, U.S. Army intelligence officer Chad Calvarasi and his wife Casey traveled to Serbia to adopt 5-year-old Sophia. Sophia had spent much of her short life suffering neglect and abuse in Serbian orphanages. And she was autistic.
Sophia is one of the most charming little girls. We fell in love with her right away.
Chad and Casey already had 3 children. Their youngest, 9-year-old Seth, was also autistic. They wanted to use their experience to help a child unlikely to find adoptive parents.
The first day we were with her, she hit us all and bit us all and pulled my hair and punched our youngest son.
Come here.
Determined to give Sophia a better life, they brought her back to America.
That first Christmas, she was writing and reading. It was just amazing.
Jesus loves me, Messiah.
We had great hope. Try not to cry. So we had great hope that, you know, we kept saying, I can't wait to see where she's going to be in 5 years. Because at that point, I was convinced that our love would heal her.
But over the next few years, Sophia became increasingly violent and uncontrollable.
The fall of 2013, she had an incident on a school bus where she aggressed towards another student on the bus and got out of her seat and jumped on the bus driver. And within a week or two, we were seeing it at home. And it just increased and increased and increased to the point that we weren't even sure how to keep her safe.
It's kind of the worst case scenario. We had to bring her to the ER twice.
Oh my gosh.
The last time where she beat herself so bad. So her nose is busted and was bleeding, and her lips were busted open, bleeding, and gave herself black eyes, and And then this was cleaned up after they cleaned up all the blood, but she had blood, all over her face.
It's estimated 1 in 10 autistic children seriously self-harm. No one really knows why. Some theories link it to anxiety caused by an overload of sensory signals. Others to frustration. Autistic children can struggle to communicate.
Behavioral disturbance is very common in children with autism, and oftentimes is readily amenable to behavioral treatments, but sometimes those behaviors, they just can't be easily curtailed and can become quite dangerous for the child.
Is she aware that she's doing this?
So she is. It's like she's caught in the fight or flight mode. So she's actually fighting, but she's fighting herself. And so afterwards, she's dealing with the pain from the injury that she just caused to herself, but she's also dealing with the sadness because you can tell, she realizes that she lost control. And she's upset that she hurt herself.
When she was aggressing towards me, my instinct is, as a mom, I just want to grab her and hold her and hug her and wait. And she got so big and strong that I couldn't do that.
In early 2016, for her own safety, Sophia had to leave home and go into a secure unit at the renowned Kennedy Krieger Institute for Brain Disorders. It often took 3 highly trained care staff using special techniques to prevent Sophia injuring herself and others.
We've tried, years of behavioral therapy and years of medication. And we've proven time and time again that for Sophia, these don't really work.
Oh, I know.
So, like every other mom dealing with any problem with their kids, I went to Google and said, Dr. Google, autism self-injury treatment. And I started finding some articles on ECT.
Casey came across author and campaigner Amy Lutz, whose own violently autistic son Jonah has had ECT for 5 years.
14 is always blue. 13 is always green.
Mommy was.
Well, ECT has been transformative for Jonah's life and for our life. I mean, we went from a period of time for years and years where Jonah was raging often multiple times a day, ferociously, and the only reason he's able to be at home, that he's able to be with us here in Atlantic City, is only able to do that because of ECT.
Amy runs a charity offering advice to parents in a similar position, and Casey has arranged to meet her.
Nothing else that we've tried has given her enough improvement that we can keep her safe. So how can we not take that chance?
Right, I think that's why for us ECT was not a hard decision. So many people asked us, they asked us about when we sent Jonah to Kennedy Krieger when he was 9, and when we ended up getting ECT later, wasn't that such a hard decision? And for me it was, no, it was the only decision. So we went into it very enthusiastically because it provided some hope that we would be able to find something that might actually work after all these failed, attempts.
Many are far less enthusiastic. This hard-hitting campaign video is made by the Citizens Commission on Human Rights, a group founded by the Church of Scientology, who oppose most psychiatric treatment. Some human rights organizations call for a total ban, especially for children. Leading the fight against ECT is Dr. Peter Bregan, who's long campaigned against the psychiatric establishment. After seeing for myself the desperation of Sophia's situation, I want to know why he thinks ECT should never be an option.
It's traumatic brain injury, TBI. The electricity not only travels through the frontal lobes, because that's where the electrodes are, and that's the seat of intelligence and thoughtfulness and creativity and judgment. It also goes through the temporal lobes, just the tip of the temporal lobes, a little further back, and that's the seat of memory. So you're blasting with an electric current the seat of memory. You are damaging the very expression of the personality.
I just want to stop right here and say that he's wrong, okay? It's not the seat of memory. Our memory is encompassed in all our cells, and it is also uses very a wide array of areas of our brain, like the amygdala. It uses because that's where you tie to emotions. For example, you might smell a smell when you were a child, or your grandmother's perfume or something, and it takes you back and you have this emotional reaction to it because you remember your childhood, you remember being with your grandmother, or you hear a song and it takes you back to a heartache you had and you remember it. So different areas of the brain, he's talking about the hippocampus is in the temporal lobes, and the hippocampus is that area, if you remember from intro, where it's like the bridge between short-term and long-term memory. And if we can get stuff across that bridge, then we can retain the memories. If we don't get it across the bridge, we lose them and we forget, like when you're studying for a test, you forget the material. So there is no seat of memory in the brain, but there are memory structures in these areas. Yes, there are. But we actually have proof that there's memory in all our cells. For example, when a woman gets pregnant, the cells in her periphery remember what it is the second time she gets pregnant, and the uterus actually comes up faster than it did the first time she was pregnant. So we know that memory is housed all over. So we can't just say there's one seat of memory in the brain. So his statements and his general, the way he's waving his hands like, this is where all the planning is done in her head and blah, blah, blah. He's really oversimplifying things, and he's actually incorrect in a way.
The character, the individuality, and even if you believe it, the expression of the soul.
Jonah is heading into New York for his latest ECT session. He's one of just a few hundred self-injuring children to have the treatment since it was introduced a decade ago. With the long-term effects not known, its use on children is blocked in some countries and in a handful of US states. But Jonah's doctor is so convinced it's effective and safe, for the first time, he's allowing Amy and our cameras to witness it.
I think almost all of the problem with ECT is misinformation, misunderstanding about what modern ECT is, and continued perpetuation of the sensationalist portrayals of the past. That's the problem.
Nervous, Amy, about seeing ECT?
I am, curious because I've wondered about it, but it's clearly not aversive to Jonah.
He doesn't fight it.
No, not at all.
Jonah, are you able to lie back down on the bed for
Lie
me?
down, Jonah.
Jonah, I'm going to start putting some of these sticky pads on you. If that's okay. I'm going to clip this to your shirt here. Okay.
Jonah.
What's your name?
Jonah.
When's your birthday?
January 9.
Jonah has had around 260 ECT sessions. The modern treatment is carried out under general anesthetic, with muscle relaxants to prevent violent convulsions.
And we're doing bilateral electrode placement at 20% below 0.5.
Doctors admit they don't know exactly how ECT works.
There's a lot of interesting new neuroimaging research showing that ECT actually reverses some of the brain problems in the major psychiatric illnesses. We don't exactly know why it works in people with autism and superimposed mood disorders, but we think it probably re-regulates the circuits in the brain that are dysregulated in these diseases.
Dr. Kellner will administer just under an amp of electric current in a series of very short pulses.
Impedance is good. Treating at 20%.
The current induces a seizure. ECT specialists believe this, in some way, resets the malfunctioning brain. Any thoughts, Amy, now that you've seen it yourself?
I mean, it's not scary. There's a little bit of movement. I mean, I've seen Jonah have a real grand mal seizure before, and that's way, way, way scarier. That's kind of what I was expecting.
The ECT alleviates Jonah's self-injuring behavior for up to 10 days. But it's not a cure.
It's generally very simple safe, easy, quick procedure like that.
There are still medical experts that are very sceptical that ECT actually does anything, particularly for children like Jonah, and that it's cruel as well.
I think those are uneducated criticisms. And the way to counter them is to show people what modern ECT is really like and show them the results with patients like Jonah.
What about long-term there? Some doctors say that they can suffer memory loss.
Well, we know a lot about long-term effects because there are patients with the more typical indications for ECT who have been getting maintenance ECT for many years, some for decades. And there really are no cumulative adverse effects of the treatment. So it seems to be very safe even to continue it for long periods.
Worldwide, about 1 million people have ECT each year, most for severe, often life-threatening depression. Around 1% are under 18. Memory loss is the main side effect, though the severity and even the definition is hotly disputed. Studies by ECT doctors suggest most memory lapses are very short term, with memory function soon returning to normal. Those against ECT have produced surveys showing more than half of patients suffer long-term memory loss.
My life is faded, with lots of black holes, which represent the memories that were destroyed through the administration of electroshock.
I don't remember my wedding day. I don't remember my husband putting ring on my finger.
When the person wakes up, they have all the signs, if they can speak, of traumatic brain injury. They may not know who they are or where they are or what's happened to them. A referee would stop a boxing match if the boxer got hit and looked like somebody coming out of ECT because they come out concussed.
In Baltimore, Sophia has been in the Kennedy Krieger Neurobehavioral Unit for 7 months, and there's been little improvement. Parents, Chad and Casey, are desperate to go ahead with ECT, but Dr. Wachtel wants to exhaust all other options first.
Most of our kids who come to the MBU do not need ECT, and people, rightfully so, are cautious when it comes to children and to children with special needs.
Okay.
Beyond that, ECT is very much a treatment rather than a cure, so you get into the issue of needing ongoing ECT, which can become inconvenient, inexpensive. If we can avoid that, then we'd certainly like to offer something that's a little bit more manageable.
We're not allowed to film in the secure unit, so I catch up with Casey after she visits Sophia. How was it?
It was a rough day.
A rough day?
Yeah. When I got there, she had been, I don't even know what triggered it. She was in a big burst of behavior. It's heartbreaking, and it scares me because I want to be able to bring her home. And I've cried a lot today because I don't know how we can bring her home.
When I told people I was coming to America to make a film about children that get ECT, people are shocked. They're like, that's barbaric, that's crazy.
I wish that people who don't understand the need for ECT could spend a couple days with Sophia. This is where we are. We're at ECT. And I have to have hope that it's going to be a miracle for Sophia because we need a miracle.
A month later, Sophia's doctors give the go-ahead for ECT.
Probably after the third or fourth treatment, we really started to see a marked improvement in her mood and an additional 30 to 40% reduction just in the sheer number of behaviors.
Where are we going, Sophia?
And in September, having been in the unit all year, Sophia is allowed home to live with her family. Sophia has been receiving intensive ECT for 6 months now. The family have relocated to Florida. The last time I visited the family, I couldn't go near Sophia for my safety and for her safety. So tonight's going to be quite an eye-opener. Hello, fellas. Hi, Sophia. I'm Chris. Hi.
Can you shake his hand?
Hello.
Great to finally meet you. We've come a long way.
Hi,
Hi.
What's his name? Do you remember?
Mr. Chris.
That's right.
I should have told you
I
that,
have a
mate.
good eye.
You do have eyes.
Yeah.
Are you happy?
Are you excited?
Hey.
Tata.
Sophia's had 33 sessions of ECT so far.
Can I have my headphones right now?
The family say they've seen a huge improvement.
There you go.
Look at me. Take a deep breath.
I'm excited.
When she has behaviors, they're much shorter, much less intense. She used to have bursts of behaviors where she was aggressing and hurting herself for hours. Now, it'll be a matter of a few minutes and she'll calm down.
Hey, Mama. I need you right now.
You got me, girl.
When I return the next morning, there's quite a surprise.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is 12.
Yeah, girl. You got it. Give it a shot.
1, 2 is 6.
Yes. There you go.
Each weekday, Sophia has school lessons with a specially trained carer.
My biggest concern was that she was going to lose quality of life, that she would have brain damage. Okay. Now she's back to, loving doing multiplication and division.
Who's that? A dog.
Yeah. When she started at ECT, she was doing zero academic work at all. Good job.
I did a Sophia Brooke.
But later that afternoon, 6 days after her last ECT, Sophia's behaviour deteriorates. Chad and her carer have to use approved restraint techniques to stop her injuring herself.
Did I go to the beach?
You know the answer to that?
He said yes.
No.
What's sparked this?
I couldn't tell you. Uptick in any type of aggression, usually towards like 1 or 2 days, day and a half prior to her usual scheduled ECT is usually what we see.
Every Friday, Sophia leaves home at 6 a.m. for her weekly ECT session.
I'm gonna be safe.
Safe.
At first, Sophia's doctors were happy for us to film the ECT procedure today, but then there was a change of heart. The reason they've given us is that they're worried about how the procedure comes across on camera, particularly with Sophia, so that's it. We can't film inside the hospital. 2 hours later, Sophia is on her way home.
We got there within 45 minutes of treatment actually happening. And she was sitting up in bed talking to 2 nurses asking for Starburst chapstick for her lips. The only memory loss that Sophia has had from ECT is she forgets that the procedure happened.
Yeah, we are. Keep going. Okay, stop. Oh. Okay, you gotta lick that part off.
It's pretty dramatic. She's sharp as a tack. She's absolutely sharp as a tack.
ECT for severely self-injuring autistic children like Sophia is still in very limited use. And without a long-term scientific study, it remains highly controversial.
Sophia, do you want to hold this?
Right now, Sophia's parents have no regrets. They have their daughter back home.
She's a joy. She brings us joy, and she loves life, and she had zero quality of life.
What about the thought of ECT every single week for the rest of her life?
It's overwhelming if I think about it, but what future did she have without it? My hope is she doesn't need it for the rest of her life.
Woo!
But at this point, I see it as like a diabetic needing insulin. it keeps her alive. Literally, it keeps her alive. And it makes it possible for us to be able to have her in our home, living life with our family, and enjoying Sophia.
I love the way she just talks back in. That's great.
Pretty amazing, huh? Just amazing. And I gotta hand it to that family. What a wonderful family to just search out somebody that nobody would want and take them in and go through all of this just to have their moments of love with her and give her a better life. Wow. I gotta hand it to this family. They're good people. And he's serving our country. Wow. Top it all off. Okay, so there's other types of brain stimulation. There's transcranial magnetic stimulation. I think, did I put a slide on this? Yes. Okay, so let me show you what this is. This is a little bit different.
We have depressed patients who have not responded adequately to at least one antidepressant treatment.
We have developed a non-invasive brain stimulation program, transcranial magnetic stimulation. You need to loosen up a little bit, okay? Relax.
There is an electrical current that goes through a small coil and causes a magnetic field. There is a camera so it can guide us based on the MRI of the brain to find the location that we have to treat.
In depression, it's aimed at the left prefrontal cortex. It stimulates this whole system down to lower brain areas that regulate mood. And electrical stimulation on the right side seems to decrease desire for the intake of food, nicotine, alcohol, cocaine, a variety of substances. So this confirms that you had a good treatment coil position at the end of the session.
After the treatment, they can go to work or continue with their daily activities.
This is a potential alternative to medication. This might be especially important for someone who can't tolerate medications, who gets side effects from medications, or someone who has a tendency to misuse or overuse medications.
Okay, so that's a short one. So the difference there is that it's the magnetic coils, and it's going towards a very specific parts of the brain. They're actually pinpointing quite nicely. Vagus nerve stimulation, this definitely has proved to be useful with epilepsy. You can watch videos on this. I didn't want to fill up too many videos on the lecture, so go ahead and seek those out. There's a whole bunch of ties to meditation with it and ways that you can stimulate your vagus nerve yourself. It's actually neural stimulation. Deep brain stimulation is planting an electrode in a specific part of the brain to try and get rid of abnormal psychological disorders or behaviors. Okay, psychosurgery is lobotomies, and you remember in the beginning, the first chapter, we talked about trephination, where we found the holes in the skull, which were probably some, an earlier form of this or the root of it. But lobotomies are performed. They start in the 1930s. They're not done as often, but they are done. Hey, you saw Sophia and her life, or if somebody's going through such severe depression they can't leave the house, they can't hold down a job, when your life is suffering and you're not really living at all and you're institutionalized, wouldn't you rather do whatever you can to have that normal time and be with your family and enjoy life, not just sit here and survive and exist? There's a difference between living and existing. So when treatments work, yes, that model gets great support. Now, the book points out a couple weaknesses to the model, saying that we are excluding, or that this model excludes non-biological factors. And there's also retraining of how to behave, how to talk to other people, just like you would raise any child and teach them how to treat others and think about others. You can still have cognitive therapy, you can still have behavioral therapy. If someone doesn't know the right thing to do, especially a child that's growing up, they still have to learn what to do in these. And then there are some undesirable effects, and there's people that point out the memory loss. But as you see, yeah, there was that lady they had at the conference saying, oh, there's all kinds of holes in my memory throughout my life. And then you've also got Sophia, who her only memory loss is forgetting she had the treatment, which, yay, that's like a good thing. We want her to forget about the treatment and not have to think about it. That's just a good thing. So that brings us along to the psychodynamic model, which is what it's called today. In the beginning, it was called psychoanalysis. You know that Freud is the father of psychodynamic theory or model or perspective. And it's based on the belief that a person's behavior is determined largely by something unconscious, right? And for Freud, there was the psychological forces, and he narrowed them down to two, eros and thanatos. And the problem with Freud, and the reason that everyone distanced themselves from him, is because he believed that all abnormal symptoms were a result of conflict of these psychological forces, or psychodynamic forces, as he called them. They were the life forces, eros and thanatos. And the problem was that he saw everything as leading to some kind of sexual conflict. And that's why people distance themselves from him, because the whole sexual side, and when we go through, we're not going to go through the stages of his theory. You should know them. You should already know them from past classes with me. But so people in this psychodynamic theory or perspective have moved away from the sexual explanation of everything and just come down to, okay, we believe it's more social. There's the three forces that shaped personality. And when we did the personality chapter in your intro course, we talked about Freud's theory of personality and how it developed. So you have the id, the ego, and the superego, and we'll just do a quick review. The id is what you're born with. It's the pleasure principle. It fueled everything. And he said, you're trying to fulfill the sexual energies through the id, and that's why in the beginning everything is oral, everything goes in the mouth. This is where the sexual pleasure is satisfied. And then we get to the ego, which is your reality principle. So the ego is dealing with reality, right? The id doesn't care. The id is I want, I want, I want. The ego is like, okay, well, we can't just go steal, or we can't just go hump a table leg in public, so we have to find other ways to satisfy ourselves and satisfy the id. And then somewhere later in life, the superego emerges out of the id. So while the id is learning how to deal with reality, out of it comes the superego. And we're not going to go into the whole thing of the phallic stage, but it's during that phallic stage, around the age of 3, that the child resolves the Oedipal complex or the Electra complex, and then incorporates the moral standards of their parents. So the morals development for Freud comes from the parents. Those are the 3 parts of the personality. So you've got the ego in the middle, and you've got like the angel and the devil on each shoulder, okay? So not that the id is always the devil, so I don't really like to use that perspective, but a lot of people bring that picture up in class. So you've got the one side saying, I want to eat the whole entire cake. And then you've got the super ego over here saying, no, 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 we'll get fat. It's not good for us. It's not healthy. Just have a small piece. Or no, saying, the super ego would probably say, don't eat any of it. It's bad for you. There's no caloric intake. And the ego says, okay, I want to keep both of you happy, so I'm not going to eat the whole cake, but I'm not going to deny myself the cake either. I'm going to have a small slice. You know those people that say, just give me a small slice. For me, it's like, give me the fat corner piece with all the icing on it. Okay, I want more icing than cake. So those are the 3 areas of the personality, and I do expect you to know them. Now, the ego, the thing that's interesting within the ego, that's where the defense mechanisms come in. So we talked about Freud's defense mechanisms the last class. We're going to go over them again in this class. And these are the things that protect us from anxiety. So if you have anxiety, you use a defense mechanism to balance everything again. So Freud sees things as conflict, and then a healthy personality or someone with a healthy brain has balance, finds a way to balance. Somebody who is dysfunctional can't handle a conflict. They don't deal with it properly. So let's look at the defense mechanism. This is how we deal with this rise of anxiety. So Freud says, we get some type of anxiety, and then we revert to one of these defense mechanisms to deal with the anxiety, to reduce it, to bring it back down into balance. Okay, so you're responsible for all of these. You need to know them. So we talk about repressions. Repression is when someone pushes it down and puts it out of their mind and ignores it as if it's not there. But he says we do this unconsciously. So we repress those bad feelings. So a lot of psychotherapy went through, okay, we have to discover what those repressed feelings are. You've repressed something to deal with it, but that's what's hurting you. Repressed something that happened to you when you were a child, and now you can't handle being told no as an adult, and it's hurting your job performance, and it's hurting your status at work and endangering your job because you never dealt with this thing as a kid. You just repressed it. So now he's going to go through years of psychoanalysis till he can bring out the source, the thing that's repressed. He has to somehow get it out of the unconscious and bring it up. And he believed that if people faced what they had repressed and faced the causes of the outbreaks of their behavior, that they could deal with it and get rid of it. And then they could go on, without having the malfunction in their life. Okay, so you need to go over each one of these denials. When you deny something is wrong, you deny that you have something, you deny that someone died, you deny the facts. Projection is when you take your unacceptable desire or your unacceptable impulse and you project it onto somebody else. So you point out that somebody else is so terrible, yet and angry all the time when you're the one who's angry all the time. Rationalization is where you rationalize what you want. You find a way to make it okay. You try and make something acceptable that really isn't acceptable to you. You don't see it that way. You've learned differently, but you rationalize it so that you can do it. You might rationalize stealing paper from your job because they don't pay you enough anyway. So you say to yourself, I'm just kind of getting the pay that I've been ripped off. They've been stealing from me because they don't pay me what I'm worth, so I'm going to take a bolt or two of paper home. Okay, that's rationalization, and we use it all the time for all kinds of things, for speeding, for everything. I'm just going with the flow of traffic, but you're still breaking the law. Well, I don't believe it's okay to break the law, but I'm going to speed because everyone else is. So we rationalize things. And this one is where I'm really pissed that I failed a test today, but when I get home, I'm going to jump down my mother's throat the first word that she says because I'm displacing my anger. I'm really not mad at her. I'm really mad at myself. Or I'm really mad at the teacher because she made the test so hard and I didn't really study. Really, you still should be mad at yourself. You're still displacing your anger. Regression is where you go back to a childhood behavior. You retreat. So some earlier stage of development. So for Freud, let's talk about his stages of development. He had the oral stage, which was the first year and a half. And that's where everything goes in the mouth. And then the anal stage, the phallic stage, latent stage, genital stage. Anal stage, obviously, is where potty training is going on, and Freud put a lot of emphasis on potty training if it was harsh. What he would say is if you didn't successfully pass what you needed to or get over the conflict and find balance at that stage, you got fixated at that stage. So you're stuck there and you have some kind of conflict that you didn't take care of and you have problems later in life. Somebody who was strictly potty trained, it would be someone who's excessively neat, maybe OCD. And then somebody who was not potty trained enough is an excessively messy person later in life. That was one of his explanations. So Freud believed that at each stage, like I said, you had to take care of this conflict, and if not, there's a fixation. So the fixation is the abnormal behavior or the abnormal function. That's what caused it, was that fixation at that stage, because things didn't go normal at that stage. You didn't get that balance in the conflict that you needed to. Two types of psychodynamic theory. There's the self-theorists. So what do? They emphasize the unified personality over any one component. So they don't look at the id, the ego, the superego. They're self-theorists. Then there's object relation theorists. So what do? They emphasize the need for interpersonal relationships. These are healthy interpersonal relationships okay, and especially between children and caregivers. Why? Because they still retain what Freud said and what research supports, that what happens to us earlier in life does shape us later in life, does affect us later in life. So it only makes sense that there's a emphasis or a value put on that relationship between children and their parents, or children and their nannies, or whoever it is, their teachers, their caregivers, their babysitters. There's definitely an emphasis and a value placed on that. So psychodynamic theories range from Freud and psychoanalysis to the modern therapies. Okay, so therapies still include some of what he used. He used free association. That's a technique in which patients describe any thought or feeling or image that comes to their mind, even if it's unimportant or irrelevant. He just encourages them just to say whatever comes to their mind. And you've probably seen the cartoons and movies and things where the typical picture of a psychologist is someone sitting with a clipboard behind somebody laying on a couch, and they're asking them how they feel and what they're thinking. Okay, so the therapist interpretation is where the therapist addresses these issues that we talked about earlier, so these defense mechanisms. So they still believe today that there's resistance, and that's where the patient is unconsciously refusing to participate in the therapy. And then there's transference. So they start to transfer things onto their actual therapist. Then there's dream interpretation. This is a process where the therapist examines the content of a person's dream. And this also was very Freudian. He believed in dream interpretation, which doesn't hold water when we look at research. It's not highly supported. This form of therapy altogether doesn't yield results. So it's weak. There's weak support for psychodynamic types of therapies. Catharsis is like reliving the past, and this is where and you're trying to settle these conflicts. So you try and overcome the problems that you didn't overcome back then. That is basically what Freud did, and his purpose of therapy and why it lasted so long, because he had to keep digging and going through everything that happened in the past to try and figure out all the problems that you're having today. So basically, working through is another process where you're facing the conflicts, you're reinterpreting your feelings, you're trying to overcome the current problems that you have. Those are still the psychodynamic choices of therapy. So we're looking at the strengths of the model. This model was really, and you can see, it was first to recognize the importance of psychological theories and treatment for abnormality. That's huge. That's, if anything's a plus from this model, if we got anything from this model, if it deserves any kind of recognition, it's for that reason. The weakness is that it is really difficult to research the unconscious or repression. That's why they don't really refer to repression as a defense mechanism anymore today, because how are you going to prove that there's a repressed memory? Because it's repressed. It's not there. You can't get to it. It's been repressed. So if it's repressed, how does anyone even know it's there? So it's very hard to research a lot of these ideas. These ideas are unobservable. I can't see the id or the ego if it's in some conscious storage place somewhere. And then, and like I said, yeah, you can't get to it. So you can't get to the unconscious. You can't bring it out and examine it. Okay, so let's go on to the cognitive model. And the cognitive behavioral model is a combination of two models or two perspectives that you learned in your first psych course. And cognitive is looking at the way we think. Behavioral is looking at the behavior, the observable behaviors. And they were very strict models that were isolated and said, you know what, we don't care about the thought process, we just care about the behavior. Let's just deal with it. Let's get rid of unwanted behaviors and increase the good behaviors. And then when they discovered observable learning or observational learning, well, then you had to come back to, okay, so there was something going on in the brain because I didn't experience your punishments, but I've learned not to do the behavior from watching you go through punishment. So obviously cognitive learning is there and a big part of it. So we have to put these two models together, the cognitive and the behavioral, and that's a good thing. Okay, so let's look at the behavioral dimension. If you remember from class, classical and operant conditioning, let me remind you of those. Remember, classical conditioning is association. It's when two things become associated with each other. Operant conditioning is the consequences of your behavior. It's the other side, okay? So preceding the response, there's some stimulus that was associated with something else, and then you get a response. Operant conditioning is the other end. The response occurs, and there's some consequence that happens as a result of the response. So in operant conditioning, we have positive reinforcement, positive punishment, negative punishment. You remember that. Classical conditioning is the pairing, the constant repeated pairing of the bell with the meat powder, remember, in the Pavlov conditioning. So we've got classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Then we've got observational learning, or modeling, as it's called, and it's where a person learns by watching other people's behavior. And that works both ways. It's not even just watching reinforcement or punishment, but I can watch, in fact, I think my kids watched me so much through life being so afraid of roaches. We lived in Florida, okay? Roaches fly at night in the air in Florida, depending on where you are. And I learned it's worse in Gainesville than in Fort Lauderdale or Boca. But up in Gainesville, they have these trees where the moss hangs, and they're beautiful. I love these southern moss hanging trees. Well, I didn't know that they're just total condos for roaches and palmetto bugs. And palmettos, cockroaches, Florida cockroach, they're all the same to me. They look the same. One flies, one doesn't, okay? Well, I didn't know that. We were walking through the trees in University of Florida one night, and bam, roaches started flying. Oh my gosh. I screamed and ran all the way to his dorm. And that was it for me. I didn't want to walk around campus anymore at night. They were on the sidewalk. It was just awful. Okay, so in the summertime, they're worse than any other time, but really it's summer 9 to 10 months out of the year in Florida. So all my life, I've been afraid of them. If I see them, if you say there's one next to me, I scream, I jump. And so my kids have witnessed me for 20 some years screaming and jumping and being afraid of roaches. Well, they're kind of afraid of them. You can't really call them to kill a roach now. They won't get near it. They're scared. They back up. They want someone else to do it. So they never had a roach crawl on them. I did when I was a kid. I'll never forget that feeling. And from then on, that was it for me. Everyone said they're more afraid of you than you are of them, and that's not true. They come straight for you. My experience is they dive bomb at you when they fly. They come for you. So I learned by associating that uncomfortable feeling of the crawling with the sight of the roach and my fear response. So in a way I was classically conditioned, and then I used operant conditioning to further cement my fear, because every time I avoid them, the fear is reduced. So that's negative reinforcement, the removal of an unpleasant stimulus. I like it when you remove an unpleasant stimulus from me. Negative means removal. Reinforcement means it's something I like. The removal of an unpleasant stimulus. Negative reinforcement. So I have negatively reinforced myself through the years of this fear of roaches. My children neither experienced classical or operant conditioning. They had modeling. They had observational learning, and they learned to fear them by watching me, by my modeling behavior. So you see the difference? I experienced classical and operant. My children experienced modeling. The overall result is that all three of us are afraid of roaches. Got it? If you remember from class, this was the Boba doll experiment. And Bandura did this experiment where he had children watch videos of a model beating up a doll. And then the kids were set loose in a playroom with all the other toys, and they went over to the Boba doll and they played with the doll the way they saw someone else play with it. That's modeling. Now, observational learning is beyond just modeling. Later, he showed consequences to the model's behavior. So a group of kids saw the model get punished for beating up the doll. Another group saw the model get reinforced and praised for beating up the doll. The results were that when the kids were let loose in the playroom, the ones that saw punishment didn't go near the boba doll. The ones who saw reinforcement beat it up really well. And the ones who saw nothing, neither consequence, beat it up. So that's modeling and observational learning in a nutshell. If you want to go back, you can find these videos online. You can watch them yourself if you like, and see all the boba doll stuff. Okay, so let's bring in the cognitive dimension. The cognitive dimension to the behavioral part is, look, let's focus on the maladaptive thinking. Let's focus on this thought process that led up to the behavior that is not good. It's not a logical way to think. It's not appropriate. So we can go in and we can look where that thought process went wrong, and let's try and fix it. Let's try and change it. A clinician or a therapist who is a proponent of this model is going to ask questions about assumptions and attitudes and thoughts of the client or the patient or the person. Abnormal functioning can result from several different ways or kinds of cognitive problems. So it could be faulty assumptions. Haven't you ever misinterpreted somebody's motives and you saw them as being aggressive or doing it on purpose? I think they did it on purpose and you're angry, when really they were just walking by and they accidentally bumped you and they never intended to. But oh, they did that on purpose. They don't like me. So we have some kind of faulty assumption. We have faulty attitudes about things. We have an illogical thought process. For example, a lot of prejudice comes from this because we overgeneralize. So we assume that, oh, they're all like that. Everybody do. Or we overgeneralize for ourselves. We will constitute poor behavior by overgeneralization. So, for example, someone has the illogical thought. There's therapists that have dealt with people who are caught up in pornography, and they say everybody does it. They just keep it quiet. So they've overgeneralized to themselves that because there are a lot of people who look at pornography, but guess what? It's not the majority of the population. The majority of the population does not view pornography. But the person who does and is addicted and has a problem with it believes or convinces himself and has this illogical thinking process that everybody does it, everybody likes it, they just keep it a secret, they just keep it quiet. No, that's not true. There's a lot of people that are disgusted by it. There's a lot of people that are sickened by it. There's a lot of people that are against making women objects. There's a lot of people that see having sex as making love and not this raunchy sexual display. So their thought process is illogical. It doesn't make sense. So a therapist can help someone recognize what's wrong with their thought process, can even bring in some statistics to show them, look, 80-some% of the population does not look at pornography, or 90. I don't have the statistics in front of me, but I do know offhand that it is the majority of people who don't use it. They just don't use it. Okay, so the cognitive behavioral interplay. So what happens here? Well, we're taking both theories and we're using them together. So for example, let's take somebody with social anxiety disorder. The first thing you want to do is change the way the person thinks. So this is a problem for them, such as they see themselves as maybe inadequate or lower or not accomplishing. So every time they go out the door, if they have this social anxiety disorder, I don't measure, I don't qualify, I'm not valuable. So we start with the thought processes and the things and the reasons. We start talking about, why do you feel like you're stupid? Why do you feel like you're not valuable? And then we go through that and we start correcting these false behaviors they have. Well, I feel like everybody's judging me. And then you can go through showing them how sometimes people aren't thinking about you at all, or everyone's looking at me when I go outside or when I go to a big social. Okay, let's go through and let's purposely count how many people are looking at you when you walk in the door. Sometimes it's no one. Sometimes a couple people close by will look up, but then when you actually make them face the illogicness of their thinking, then they start to see, okay, then they start to see the opposite. We do confirmation bias. We're always looking for confirmation of what we already think, of our bias, right? So when I go on the road and I believe that all old people drive slow in the fast lane just to ruin it for the rest of us, then whenever there's an older person in the fast lane driving slow, I say, see, yep, there's another one, another one, another one. Yeah, that's like 100 people I've seen in my lifetime that are always over here. But I never look for the opposite of my belief. So I should go look to counteract it and see, well, let me go to the slow lane and let me count how many old people are over here. Oh, shoot, way more. So the majority of old people do not ride in the fast lane. They ride in the slow lane. I'm looking at the exception, not the rule. So the first thing you want to do is start to correct wrong thinking. And you can see how social anxiety would start to build up wrong thinking. Now we got to deal with the behavior. The behavior is avoidance. They're not going outside. So it's just like my avoidance with the roaches. Every time I avoid them or get away from them or run away or avoid a place that might have them, it reduces my anxiety. So what have I just done? Bam! I just further strengthen that conditioning to my fear. Same thing with people with social anxiety. Every time they avoid going to a social event, that makes their level of anxiety decrease and they feel better. So they've just strengthened the behavior of avoidance. So now we have to start working with them and counteracting those behaviors. We can use classical therapy to do it, or we can use therapy that comes from operant conditioning, such as using, again, reinforcers or punishments. So exposure therapy comes straight out of the classical conditioning model, and we use exposure therapy like, for example, I won't submit myself to this. I will happily live the rest of my life with my fear of roaches, but you expose someone to the thing that they are afraid of. You can do it online. You can do it in their mind. Just have them close their eyes in a safe space with the therapist and think about it till it's uncomfortable. Or you can actually flood them and take them right out. They've got a fear of heights, take them right out to the edge. Or remember in class, we brought a tarantula into class. So people with fear of spiders, we kind of flooded them with a spider actually being in the room. We didn't force anyone to touch it though. Let me make that clear. Okay, so when we talk about the strengths of this model, well, it is one of the most common models to deal with fear, and it's easy to use classical conditioning therapies to treat several disorders. So it's become really powerful in the field because, and almost half of practicing psychologists or therapists, as you can see, are using this model or this theoretical approach. Okay, it can be tested in laboratories. That's what I've always loved about a behavioral model. The behavioral model can be tested. It's observable. I can count how many times a behavior occurs. I can count how many times there's a spike in a certain part of the brain, or I can count how high a blood pressure goes. Those kind of things we can observe, we can test, and we can observe, and we can measure how well the model is working or how well the treatment is working. They're research-based. That's another big plus to this. So the research supports them. It shows that they are actually helpful. They actually are effective in treating several disorders. So they're real important. It's a great perspective. In fact, it's one of my favorite. I like the bio as well, but this is one of my favorite. Okay, so the weakness of it, well, disturbed thoughts and behaviors are found in many disorders, and their precise role, how they actually affect the abnormal functionality, their abnormality, well, it's yet to be determined. So we can treat the symptoms. It's kind of like going back to that statement. Sometimes doctors and drug therapists are accused of this, that you're treating the symptoms, but you're not treating the cause. So that's one of the criticisms as well. And they're not always successful with all clients. Well, not everything is successful all the time. So that's kind of something we could say across the board with most therapies. Now, there is a new wave of them that has emerged. And for example, there's what's called ACT. It's acceptance and commitment therapy, and you can see it right here. Okay, I'm just going to say ACT because it's easier. So this is where you help clients accept what's happening and rather than judge themselves, okay? They judge themselves harshly. So accept the client, accept what's happening, don't judge yourself. As a therapist, don't judge them, and you address their negative biases and other people's negative bias. So somebody who's a really good example of this, again, I hope you watched the movie or the clip on John Nash. You can just accept and live with. And he has schizophrenia. So he's still taking the other treatments. He's still using the medication, but he accepts that he's always going to look at things and see, well, that could be the government trying to, this big secret organization in the government trying to control the people. He still sees how that's possible, and he'll tell you, it's possible. But I realize that it's possible. I realize that it may not be as well. It may not be truth. So he's learned to just live the way people want him to and have a more what people consider normal thinking. Okay. So also mindfulness-based techniques right here. I want you to know both of these forms of therapy. The mindfulness meditation is used to help clients achieve acceptance. So I want you to look at page 65 in your book, and there's a mindfulness worksheet that I put online, and we're going to be using or practicing or trying out some of these techniques because they're good for anybody in life, normally healthy or not, but they're very helpful with anxiety and depression. So if you've ever had bouts of times where you are depressed or feeling anxious, some of these techniques may be great for you just to have daily in your life, just to keep a nice, healthy balance. And also I want you to read Info Central, which is page 66 in your book. Okay, so those I may use on the exam. So the cognitive behavioral approach has been criticized as being too narrow, and that it focuses only on these two aspects of functioning, which is thought and behavior, which is a huge part of everything we do. But of course, there's emotions and other things as well. But okay, so let's move on to the humanistic view. This model actually unites humanistic and existential view. So we're looking at both at the same time. So the humanistic view, you can see, emphasizes people as friendly, cooperative, constructive, and the focus is on the drive to self-actualization. So it's just helping people honestly look at themselves, basically, is what they try and do. And they try and have them come to the conclusion on their own. So you can look up Carl Rogers, go ahead and look him up online. Watch this therapy he has with a young housewife. You'll see her with short black hair and she's smoking, and you can full on see exactly how this therapy works. But it's basically being supportive. It's called client-centered therapy, and it's a supportive approach that is accepting. It's accepting the person how they are, not making them feel judged, and just kind of letting them go on and on about everything, and then they try and make them come full circle into seeing things for what they are. So they keep restating, and you'll see if you watch him, he'll keep restating back to the person what they just said. So the existentialist model places an emphasis on self-choice, self-determination, individual responsibility. That's what I really want you to keep in mind when you think about this view. It's when it's all about the person taking responsibility for themselves. The focus is being on authentic about it. So you're trying to correct people into accepting real truth or being more accurate with their self-awareness. These are the type of people when they're suffering, and this theory is good for people who don't take responsibility for their own behaviors, those who choose to hide from responsibility, those who try and blame everyone else. And you probably know somebody in your life that tries to blame everybody else for what their problems are. They claim to be helpless. They claim to be victims all the time. They have dysfunctional lives basically as a result of it. And they're losing jobs all the time, or they're having to quit them or whatever, and it's usually their own fault. When you keep having this problem across a whole array of people or places or jobs or things, then you're the common element between the two. You're probably where the problem is, but people live in denial and they don't accept responsibility and they don't accurately look at themselves and look at the situation in life for what it is. So, a good example of this is the beginning of this chapter when we read Philip Berman, his story. If you haven't read that, you should go back and read it because he has a classic case of this. So, existential philosophers hold that humans are constantly searching for defining themselves and for meaning through their actions. So that's that perspective. Okay, so I told you a little bit about Rogers' therapy. It's called unconditional positive regard. I encourage you very much to just watch a few minutes or so of the interview or the therapy that he posted online, or somebody posted. If it's actually of him, you can learn from the greats. It's of him with one of his clients, and then you'll get the whole gist of what it is. The therapist creates this supportive environment by making them feel unconditionally supported, not judged, and gives real empathy to them and restates what they're saying so that they feel like they're being listened to and that the person understands where they're coming from. And you do have to be genuine in it. You are genuinely restating what you think is accurate while withholding your own personal judgment. For example, when she talks about cheating on her husband, I'm sure as a husband, Carl Rogers probably had some feelings about that, but you'll never see anything come out. He's only positive with her. He only reinforces what she's saying and allows her to come full circle on thoughts of how she thinks about that or how that is viewed. But the goal here is to guide the client towards self-recognition through challenge and frustration. So some of the techniques that are used in this way are role-playing. Role-playing is a big one because you can get somebody to see other points of view and see things from a different perspective. Skillful frustration is just demanding that clients stay in the here and now. So when they're going through therapy, they keep their thoughts at the very emotions and embracing their feelings right now. Role-playing, you act out various roles, you encourage to express your emotions. Again, it's the expression of emotions. So there's been little research done here, and this is a problem for most theorists or therapists or people in the field, is that, look, it's subjective, it can't be measured, it's what people believe, it's self-awareness, you can't measure these things. So there's very little research that's been done, therefore there's no support for it. Now, spiritual views are also included under this model. The problem with this is that for most of the 20th century, clinical psychologists did not consider spirituality or religion a good thing. In fact, they viewed it mostly as negative, at best neutral, but mostly negative. But research doesn't support that. Research shows that people who have some kind of spiritual life, no matter what the religion, but if they have some kind of spiritual life and belief, that they turn out to be healthier psychologically. So it's just a correlation. So you remember from the last class, if something's correlated, it doesn't mean one causes the other. We can't tell which causes which, and we can't tell if there's some third variable somewhere causing both. But when something is correlated, we know that they go together. So good mental health goes with a spiritual life. Those are correlated. So research does support that people who are spiritual or describe themselves as highly spiritual also are better psychologically, functioning wise. But even though it's correlation, many therapists make a point of including some kind of spiritual treatment or religious discussion with their clients, and they do address that side. Existential theories and therapy. So they believe that, first of all, the abnormality arises when a client uses self-deception. Remember what I told you. This is where they do not accept responsibility. They try and blame it on everyone else. Someone quits a job, all the time. They keep quitting. They keep finding excuses to quit, and it's always something wrong with somebody else. They never accept the responsibility themselves. So what is the therapy? Trying to get them to accept responsibility for their lives, for the problems that are in their lives, for the problems they keep encountering, getting them to look at themselves and tap into themselves and what it is that they're failing to recognize and accept this personal responsibility for their problems and for their action, and making them realize that they're free to act. They made their choices. Your life and your problems are, for the most part, a result of your personal choices that you've made through life, and eventually you have to live with the consequences of those choices at some point, to some extent. So the goal of treatment here, it's more important to use use an eclectic approach of therapy tools, but whatever it takes to get somebody to face reality. And there's a great emphasis that they place on the client-therapist relationship, and because it's in the humanistic view or perspective, it's creating that non-judgmental, safe environment and relationship between the client and the therapist, so that the client can come to the conclusions they need to come to, so they can explore and be open instead of putting up a wall to seeing what's wrong, what needs to be changed, what needs to be done. But because they don't use controlled research and they don't use the scientific method to check on their therapies to show proof that it works, there is little proof that it works. So the effectiveness of this model is not there, or it's not proven. It's not out there for us to look at. The strength overall for this is that it's so positive. That's really what everyone emphasizes with the humanistic approach in any kind of way, is that it's looking into the positive side of things, trying to see the individual more so than the brain system or individual pieces, just emphasizing the individual, being optimistic about it. And it emphasizes good health being possible for everyone. So those are some of the strengths of this model. And it's a strong model, it is. But it also has many weaknesses. And the number one weakness is that they don't use the scientific method, or they reject the scientific method to support it. So that would be, and they also focus on abstract issues. So that would be another reason. Now, the sociocultural model is something we look at because we are in a social environment almost all the time, and we are a product of our culture. Our culture has an influence on us whether we want it to or not. You can't stop it. We are not born into a vacuum or a seclusion. We're born into systems. So this perspective is looking at family and multicultural perspectives. So the background of it is that the family social perspective and the multicultural perspective are joined. Okay, so that's where we get the sociocultural perspective. And it assumes that abnormal behavior is best understood in light of the forces, the broad forces, that outer ring, if you're looking at a schematic of how you, the individual, and then next to you is the immediate family, then your friends and teachers and peers, and then it gets bigger and bigger till it goes out to the culture, is usually the last big circle when we're drawing one of those pictorials of the individual and what influences them. So it's that broader force that influences the individual. So the model addresses the norms of the people's role in society. Okay, so within that role, we have our family. And because of this, the family structure is something that's looked at. So you look at the labels, you look at the roles that are involved, the diagnostic labels. And one thing I'm really going to emphasize is the social connections and the support. So research shows that individuals with few social connections or individuals with dysfunctional social connections have a greater chance, or there's more psychological dysfunction. So that makes a very good test question. Few or dysfunctional social connections lead to a greater chance of psychological dysfunction. Let's say it that way. So online relationships on Facebook or whatever else you're on, they're not a substitute for real world relationships and friendships. You have to understand that. As much as they're great at keeping us connected, they're great at making ways for mass communication, keeping up with people, they are not a substitute for real world friendships. So that's important to remember, and that's something that this model takes very seriously. So the family structure and communication is grounded in the family systems theory. So in this theory, abnormal functioning within a family leads to abnormal behavior of the members of the family. Okay, so if you come from an insane environment, well, you're going to have insane behavior. So if you have this crazy dysfunctional life at home, the way the family functions together, more than likely that the members of that family are going to take it out of that family structure, and it's going to happen when they get out among other people. Okay, and then you also end up with disengaged family structures. Okay, so let's think about that further. If you're going to treat from that perspective, the family social perspective, then it leads to the types of therapy that we're talking about here. So several treatment approaches that we're looking at. Well, group therapy is not the family coming together. Group therapy is when we bring like people that have the same problem together and have a therapy session with everyone together. So if you are somebody who suffers from social phobia, if we can get you all there, we'll have a group therapy session where everybody suffers from social phobia. So you start to support each other, and when those similar problems are brought together, it helps. It's almost like self-help. These self-help groups of people with similar problems can help and support each other and say, you know, I've already been through that, or this is how I handled that, and oh, I've had that too. And just hearing that somebody else has the same exact things, the same exact thoughts, it helps you feel, okay, I'm not the freak. I'm not completely alone here. I'm not completely abnormal. People have gone through this before, so let me attach and learn from, and it really does help a lot. There's a case of schizophrenia that I know about where he had isolated himself so much, so he got together with other people that had schizophrenia that were afraid to leave the house, and they helped each other greatly. He ended up being able to get a job and hold it down so he could actually go out into the world and interact with other people again, and group therapy was a huge part of him being able to do that. Family therapy, that's a therapy in where the therapist meets with all the members of the family. It's just like it sounds. So this is easy stuff for the test, and believe me, there will be questions on it. So know that group therapy is where you're not related to the people, but all the people have the same problem you have. Family therapy is where you are related. It's where all the family members come together, and then you help the family change in therapeutic ways. Okay? Couple therapy is just that. Couples, married couples that are maybe, or a couple that's thinking about getting married, so they might want to go to couple therapy first and get some things ironed out. And, you know, it's a good preparation or preventative measure. And I definitely suggest it to anyone. There's nothing wrong with it. I don't want you to be embarrassed or think of it. It's a very smart thing to do. I went with my husband to we call it premarital therapy, and it was 6 weeks of counseling with our pastor before getting married to make sure that we thought of things we should think of past, oh, he's so cute, I'm so in love and starry-eyed. Well, therapy helps you see things the way it is. So a therapy format like this is basically between two people that have either shared a long life, maybe they're at the brink of divorce, so they've been together a long time, or maybe somebody who's starting out right in the beginning and wants to have this long-term relationship. So it's a good idea to go to couples therapy or marriage counseling or premarital counseling or whatever it is, couples therapy. Community treatment is a treatment approach that emphasizes community care. So these are like agencies, group homes, community health centers. These type of places provide a type of care that's necessary, and there's 3 levels of it, and I want you to know those 3 levels. So one would be primary prevention. You can remember these easy because it's actually 1, 2, 3. Primary prevention, secondary prevention, and tertiary prevention. The primary prevention is to change attitudes and policies. Second is to treat disorders early. And then the third level out, tertiary prevention, is providing treatment for people who have it. You have moderate or severe pathology, so at this time you need to provide treatment. That's what community treatment is. First, changing attitudes and policies. Second thing they want to do is have that goal of identifying and treatment of disorders early. So bring people into this community therapy before it becomes something severe. And then the last thing is, okay, when it's severe, definitely bring it in. Let's deal with it. Talk about the avatar. This is on page 75. I want you to read that box. It talks all about avatar type of therapy, the things you can do with it. This is great for treating phobias, probably most used for that. Fears, phobias, traumatic memories. This way, you don't have to face it face to face. You can do it in a virtual reality. And the question there, clients know they are entering a make-believe world when they receive avatar therapy. So why do so many actually make progress? Why? So I want you to answer that question. They give you the answers in that box somewhere, but read the whole box. I don't want you to just go through and look for the answers to that. It's an interesting excerpt on this new form of therapy. All right, multicultural theorists. So what does that mean? Well, let me remind you that culture is the set of values, attitudes, beliefs, history, behaviors, all of the things that are shared by a group of people and passed down to the next generation. That is culture. So let me remind you of that. So multicultural, culturally diverse psychology is this growing field of study that wants to understand how culture, ethnicity, gender, different factors that affect our behaviors and our thoughts of all these different cultures, races, how do they differ psychologically? So that's what this perspective comes from. It's looking at the abnormal disorder or behavior from this multicultural perspective. I believe that it's something should be incorporated with all of them, not a separate one, but it should be in all of them. The treatment therapists use is, one, the therapists themselves need to have a greater sensitivity to the cultural issues. So you want to make sure that you are sensitive to what that culture in particular has to deal with or go through. I'll give you an example. When I was over in Saudi Arabia, I was teaching psychology over there for a couple years, and I had students coming to me. I mean, as soon as someone finds out you're teaching psychology, people come to you and start talking about issues. And we talked about issues in class too. But some of the cultural issues that we talked about, many of their personal issues were very much like any college student over here in America. Many of them. I was kind of surprised at how much like us they are. But they have cultural issues. And those issues came up. And the more I learned about them and was able to be sensitive, the more they opened up and the more they actually became appreciative in a lot of ways. But I learned the Quran. I learned why they have certain practices. I learned why they cover their heads and what's behind it and all these different cultural issues. And when I became more sensitive to it and educated myself instead of being ignorant to it, for example, they love taking selfies. We take pictures together, but I never posted them on Facebook if they told me they didn't want them anywhere. They just wanted to have a picture. I just want a picture with you, Dr. Julie. I just want to remember you. I don't want my picture anywhere. And of course, I wouldn't, because I understand why they don't want that. I understand their cultural issues, and I understand when I go to their house and I would meet them and I would meet their families, there were certain things I would or wouldn't do out of respect, out of sensitivity, because I understood these cultural issues. That's how a therapist has to be as well. You can't sit there and judge people from a Western point of view. You must understand the different cultures. You have to understand that they are going to spend a lot of time socializing with you before they're going to get down to what you plan the meeting for. And you have to be sensitive to that. That is their culture. If you jump right into, let's just get down to business. We said we're going to meet because of this. Wow, it's so offensive. It's so hurtful to them. No, it shows that you don't like them at all, that you don't care about them as a person. You must stop and you must take the time to do what we call small talk, kind of just chatty type things. That has to happen first. Then you get down to business, and you don't do it in any other way. Otherwise, it ruins the culture and the respect that they have for each other. They have this great respect for each other, and they do not overstep that. They want that human touch. They want that human interaction and connection and seeing me and you as a person and being social first. And so those kind of things you have to be sensitive to, and I learned that, and it's time consuming. And over here we're always in a rush, and we just want to get to the meat of things. And well, actually on the shore here in Virginia, this is a very rural area, and if anyone's listening to this that doesn't live in an area like this, if you live like I did back in the city in Boca Raton or Fort Lauderdale, we aren't used to this type of lifestyle. Here on the shore, people do take the time to first be social and talk to each other, and things do take longer, and you don't ever just do business with somebody. It's always a pretty good conversation, even when I'm at a restaurant or something and it's my waitress or the owner or something. You would spend time speaking with them. So this is a great form of therapy, actually, and I think it's something we should incorporate in all forms of therapy, or perspective. So let's look at the strengths of this model, this perspective. It adds to our clinical understanding of abnormality, definitely. It increases our awareness. I think even the biological model, there's certain people that come from certain cultures, from certain areas of the country, they're more susceptible because of skin color or tone or toughness or roughness of skin. There's so many different things. Hepatitis B, I think, is more common in Africa than here. Or when they come here, they're more susceptible to getting it because of the difference in the climate. So you could take that whole culture or race of people and bring them over here, and you're going to see a biological different phenomenon because of it. So these socio-cultural factors exist, and it's only a strength to take them into consideration. So that's something that's really strong about this model. It's one of the good reasons that we have it. But also there's the weakness that research is difficult to interpret. And that's because the overwhelming possible combinations and confounds that could pop up you cannot put safeguards in experimental research for every facet of culture and social dynamic that is in a person's life. So that makes research very difficult in this one area if all you're going to do is look at these aspects. And a lot of times these models are unable to predict abnormal behavior with any kind of specificity. So it's basically because it's limited to correlational design. So it doesn't explain abnormality within and across cultures. It's unable to predict, because it focuses on explaining things within and across culture. It loses sight of the individual and just looking at the individual without that consideration. So okay, love this slide. This is something you should use for your test. I will definitely take test questions off of this. It just takes everything we went over and puts it in this nice picture for you to get it all straight, because we just went over so much information. So I'm the kind of mind, at least me, I like stuff put in one picture like this. This is everything we just talked about. So I could say to you, okay, little Susie is having a problem keeping a job, and she's quit the last 4 jobs she's had. She's moved back home with her parents, and she can't seem to make it on her own. So this is a dysfunctional behavior. What model, if you're looking at this chart, would you use to be your perspective to give her therapy, to just start therapy or some advice to little Susie? That's a great test question. So you would think about, well, it doesn't sound like a biological malfunction. The question didn't mention anything about her having any kind of underlying conflict or something that happened in childhood. It doesn't mention anything about her thinking or that she's watched other people quit, like her parents quit jobs repeatedly. Maybe it's not cognitive behavioral. It could be self-deceit, but it sounds like existential. That would be the first model I would start with working with her. Not that all of the others shouldn't be considered, but because she is quitting jobs, it sounds like the avoidance and moving back home and not being able to support herself. It's avoidance of responsibility. So it's a good place to start. Might find out later that it's some underlying conflict that she didn't resolve in childhood, and then, wow, we need to go back to the psychodynamic. Okay, or I might ask you something about a model that's strongly supported by research and deals with people's behavior, observable behavior. Well, research support, is strong for the biological and the cognitive behavioral because they're so easy to measure. And because I mentioned behavior, it's not the biological, so you go right to cognitive behavioral, and that would be your choice for the answer. Do you see how I can make a lot of test questions out of this chart? So I definitely want you to focus on this chart and study it. This is definitely a tool that you should make some flashcards off of and study yourself and have somebody quiz you. We want to look at psychopathology across age. Basically, we're going to look at how things change as humans age. So with that perspective, the central perspective principles are the equifinality and the multifinality. Now, the equifinality is the idea that there's multiple pathways that can lead to the same disorder. But the multiple finality is that it's the principle that individuals have similar developmental variables that react in different ways and have different outcomes. So in the end, all of them come out the same, which is equifinality, or in the end, they don't come out the same. There's different outcomes. That's multifinality. That's how I remember the difference between the two. Finality means in the end. Are they all the same, or is there multiple? Okay, and then not mentioned here on this slide is the biopsychosocial model, which is an important integrative model, and that's just where the theorists believe that abnormality results from the interaction of genetic, biological, developmental, emotional, behavioral, cognitive, social, societal influences, you name it. So they see it as they're putting bio, they're putting psychological, and they're putting social all together. Okay, so that's the biopsychosocial model. That's another one that integrates everything together. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 3. And make sure that you do all your practice tests, and I will see you soon.